Wow, what a panel and what a day. And I'll have some closing remarks. But I want to do is to move to the next panel, which actually I think looks to the future because it's the future of health and longevity. And we have a unique speaker who's not usually that you think of, but in fact, he's a future-looking individual who's done so much already, and that's in fact Nuba Afiyan. So for those who missed my early remarks, welcome. This final speaker, Dr. Afiyan, is a pioneer in the field of biotechnology and biopharmaceutical. He's a recently elected fellow of National Academy of Engineering because his background in engineering, but we certainly welcome him as a peer into medicine. Because he's the founder and CEO of Flagship Pioneering. For those who have not heard of Flagship, think about Moderna. That's how I look at it. But Flagship is a company that's developed more than 100 scientific ventures, resulting in over $100 billion in aggregate value, $100 billion in aggregate value. Thousands of patents and patent applications, more than 50 drugs in clinical development. So that's Nuba. So during his career as inventor, entrepreneur, and CEO, he's co-founded and helped build over 70 life science and technology startups. And of course, as I said, he's the founder and co-chair of Moderna. We're all grateful to him and to Moderna. During COVID, certainly he's done a huge amount of helping through the mRNA vaccine for many, many individuals. But I can go on to how many companies he's founded, but the important issue is he's got this concept that he's putting forward. It's called preemptive health. The idea is what we talk about today when you talk about healthy longevity, healthy health span, and healthy lifespan. Because the whole idea is protecting, maintaining, or improving people's health prior to illness. The goal is to serve people before they become patients, therefore adding years to life and life to their years. Nuba is going to talk about this concept. He's been now put forward and he's been championing it, has even founded an entity in Moderna to push this forward. The idea would be health should be accessible to all, just been said before about equity. And this initiative at Flagship, Preemptive Health and Medicine, is pursuing interventions that protect health from external threats and those who can prevent or delay the onset of illness or diseases. I think if realized, this is obviously a major step forward and is totally consistent, of course, with the way we look at health longevity. So we want to hear from Nuba, his concept. I have lots of questions for him, how to realize it, because in today's world of, what's being reimbursed, what's being approved, how do you put this concept before people get ill to actually have the ability to predict and therefore to prevent or intervene? So Nuba, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for inviting me here today. And what I'll do in the first 10 or 15 minutes is just run through some slides, lay out some concepts, and then look forward to the discussion. Forgive me for going through these slides very, very quickly, just given the time frame. But I thought what I'd do is talk about a couple of things. I want to just introduce to you very high level what Flagship Pioneering does and why we think this can result in the kind of innovations we need to make systemic change, use an example in the case of Moderna as to what we learned from it, and then move on to talk about preemptive health and medicine. So let me dive right in. I hope you can see the slides. So I think it's fair to say, and this audience needs no reminder, that we are in fact living in a century where we expect the contributions of biology to match or exceed those of physics and chemistry in the past and join them as they impact not only human health but also the health of the planet. And that's exactly where our innovations are focused. And we think that there are so many aspects of the human condition that we can address through these newfound both knowledge and technology, and therefore solutions. Importantly, some of the things we've been encountering of late with our health security being threatened and COVID-19, and I'm going to say more about that as we proceed. So Flagship, as Victor mentioned, is you could think of it as a BioPlatform Foundry. We conceive, create, resource, and develop companies that basically are predicated on brand new biological platforms that then in turn are attempting to impact human health and sustainability. And you heard about some of the scale and scope of it. And what we've done is we've combined the ability to create scientific capital, human capital, and financial capital, and combine them in order to make the kind of bioplatforms that we think will be important. So let me just give you a quick snapshot. This is a lot of logos and words, but just to point out that we think that the notion of a bioplatform, and that is a set of technologies or a new drug modality or a newfound knowledge in biology, where one common investment in this can actually generate many, many products. And we're finding these have applications in new innovations in nucleic acid-based therapies and vaccines, all the way to cells and novel biologics. And so what you're seeing on this slide is the last 4 or 5 years primarily of work that we've done to produce many, many new capabilities. And the reason I say that is that we think that this notion of a bioplatform is important in how we think about innovating, not just when it comes to disease, but also upstream of disease. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me use the messenger RNA bioplatform as one such example. As Victor mentioned, Moderna is a company that we founded out of our own Flagship labs in the year 2010. It was the 18th such company that we had created and launched. And what you see here is essentially the basic idea, which is that a code-based molecule, mRNA, encased in a particular type of delivery vehicle, in our case, a lipid nanoparticle, upon a lot of engineering of both, we felt could in turn essentially be able to transiently reprogram one aspect of cellular life and allow us to make any protein we wanted, whether these proteins were secreted, transmembrane, etc., or go to the nucleus. And that was the original idea, and that's essentially what we spent about a decade developing the capability to do. By the year 2019, we had in fact reduced this to a level where we could essentially have an idea of the protein to make and computationally design it, make it, and deliver it to a patient within weeks. And we were doing this for one particular application, which was personalized cancer vaccines, a very important addition to the arsenal of cancer immunotherapies, which we felt would leverage this capability, because when you're talking about personalized vaccines, you need personalized sequence information from which to derive neoantigens and then take a combination of them and deliver it back to the patient. And that was fortuitous because actually when we were presented by the challenge of COVID-19 and the actual virus, we essentially took that bioplatform, the mRNA, the LNP, plus the whole design and manufacturing capability, and shifted it to focus on what was not a cancer target, but a viral target, nevertheless a novel sequence that we used the same capability to be able to make a vaccine with. And what this lays out is the timeframes that were involved, which many of you will know about. Essentially on January 11th, we saw for the first time the RNA sequence of the virus. By the 13th, we had already made our first, designed and made our first instance of what became the actual eventual vaccine, the mRNA 1273, loaded with LNP. And then we started doing the very first human trials in partnership with the NIH, which then led to the FDA giving an emergency use authorization by December of the same year, and subsequently have expanded it to have 2 additional versions of this vaccine, bivalent. All of this is possible for a number of reasons that I thought I'd share with you, because we have to keep this instance in mind as we think about achieving even more and venturing into kind of this uncharted territory of thinking about what else can we do to ensure healthy longevity. Some of the things that enabled this is centrally that we're dealing with information molecule in the form of mRNA. The fact that we had prior to this already shown in 9 distinct infectious disease vaccines that we could actually do this and go into the clinic and show, at least in phase 1, the efficacy and early safety. We had already worked in partnership with the NIH, which featured what proved to be a very important partnership for us, and a number of other things that had a lot to do with the fact that we had digitized everything. This is an important concept over and beyond the biotechnology aspect. This was very much a digital native company, and that helped a lot to be able to scale and move very quickly. Now, if you zoom out from that example and you say, okay, what do we mean by this type of code-based molecule? We really think that we're entering an era of programmable medicines, where rather than thinking about a computer program of zeros and ones, you can actually write an effective biological program, which, albeit in a fairly narrow way, can be interoperable with our cellular operating system and be able to use the body to make the proteins or the cells that we wish to make. And where we started a decade ago with one such programmable medicine, what exists today in the current ecosystem of Flagship is a number of programmable platforms, ranging from the left to a number of DNA-based programs, gene writers, epigenomic controllers, to the middle, where we've expanded beyond mRNA to include tRNA, and then in proteins that now are computationally programmable. We're not going to have time to talk about that today, all the way to cells that are essentially programmed cells. And I use this to just say that if we can operate at the speed of code and of being able to very rapidly and modularly replace what we're doing and achieve a different result, we think that can make this a far more engineerable act, as opposed to what we've done over the past 4 decades that I've been involved in biotechnology innovation, which has been a rather artisanal activity and a rather slow one at that. The second important force that we have to contend with today is that at the same time and away from biotechnology, there's been tremendous advances in the computing fields, and most recently and most notably, the advent of machine learning and artificial intelligence, something that's been developed for 50 years. But when I say advent, I mean at the level, at the scale, at the speed, and at the power that it really now has become useful in many, many applications beyond just supercomputing and a relatively narrow use as well that was being made in the intelligence community. And what's interesting is the intersection between the similar advances in biology and computing that we think now create even more, even beyond programmable molecules, a whole a shift in what we're able to aspire to. So we are encouraged that this is the right moment to be thinking about the next and last thing I want to talk to you about. And that is thinking about this notion of pandemics and realizing just how much this fast pandemic that we've been living with exists alongside many slow pandemics that we take for granted and unfortunately suffer with, whether that's obesity or diabetes or cancer. And we don't view these as pandemics, but they really are every bit as much broad, hitting the whole globe, causing major loss of life and quality of life as well. And one of the interesting things that we learned over the last year that makes us even more pay attention to this is the degree to which these slow pandemics combined with the fast pandemic is what led to the biggest health damage done by this virus. So we may think that fast pandemics deserve our attention, but in fact, the past pandemics have exposed the degree to which we have done relatively little on the slow pandemics and how exposed our health resiliency is to such threats. So what am I talking about? Just very briefly, and I know everybody here is an expert in this area, but I'll just give you my perspective on this field. I would argue that today's health system is not all that healthy, and I don't mean by that the economics of it or the delivery or what I mean by that is that we seem to be thinking about healthcare at the level of society in a way that's limited only to sick care. And many other people have said that of late, and we've been kind of advocating this notion, because if you just look at how much of our money in what we call our healthcare budget actually starts with disease forward, it's about 97, 98%. where people are actually keeping count. In the UK, it's a little over 97% that of the overall spending goes upstream of disease. That includes all of prevention and everything else that one can do. Now, what if that number was 5%? What if that number was 10%? Well, that would be a dramatic change in what would be possible, but in fact, it's not. On the other hand, at the level of individuals, not at the level of society, I think we have a different problem, which is a problem of expectations. I mean, as individuals, we are willing to let our governments exercise massive intrusion into our privacy in order to deliver physical security. But when it comes to health, partly based on the history, partly based on the way it is provisioned, we have a health system which basically doesn't really do much to protect us. It basically just deals with the consequences of intrusions, of things that become problems. It would be like terrorism enters a place, is rampant, and then we start doing something about it. And the juxtaposition, we think, between how we think about our health security and how we think about our physical security was quite exposed during the pandemic, but we think we can't just kind of sweep that under the rug and say, well, now let's go back to business as usual. We think the current status quo is at the same time inefficient, inequitable, and economically unsustainable. We think part of the economic unsustainability is that in most cases, when a disease has essentially taken hold, it's too late to cost effectively deal with it. And that is a thought that most people reject because it is not the premise and basis of our medical kind of paradigm. But in fact, in other activities, we've learned many a time that it's too late when something's gone wrong, whether it's an airplane that's flying or a car that's driving. You have to do a lot upstream, and somehow it's been very difficult to do it with health. As Victor mentioned, we think a lot about this duality of adding years to life, but also adding life to years, and what we consider this duality of lifespan and health span maximization, which is what you mean by healthy longevity. And so the question, we think of what-if questions. So we ask ourselves, what if individuals and societies were serious about securing and protecting health? What if that was a right? What if we really thought about resiliency and health as a key governmental objective? And what that means is, what if we went from a model where you would diagnose and treat disease and then provide care when we can't do much about the disease? What if we shifted to actually detecting threats, detecting breaches of health threats, and then really thought about preempting? And by preempting, we mean delaying or derailing the course of a disease. That's what we mean by preempting. I want to distinguish this from preventing in the way that one could distinguish a cure from a treatment. I think preventing where possible is a great goal, but I think if as society we start, or medical profession, we start promising prevention, we're going to be disappointing a lot of people. Every bit as much as curing would be a very difficult bar to reach. Once in a while we will. But preempting, we think, has quite a different prospect, and so we think that's something that we should be working on now. So we call preemptive health the use of non-drugs, non-new chemical entities to target disease precursors, and using modern data-driven machine learning technologies to segment not populations as to stage of disease, but as to stage of pre-disease, and being able to identify people who are within a short time to the onset of symptomatic disease and see if we can actually intervene at that stage. Now, as Victor said, you got to think about how's that regulated, who's going to pay for it. All of that are things that we need to confront, but that would be, we think, an important change in the paradigm by which we're thinking about healthcare. We think that's the case. And then preemptive medicine would be now using actual medicinal compounds and approaches to delay not only disease onset, but also progression of pre-disease. So delay disease, keep the disease in a very early stage. All of these things, we think the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent in the last 40 years of doing biotech research can and should be used at the earliest, if not earlier than when we can detect disease. And we've gone about a number of projects that are beginning to do this, ranging from finding bioactives that could become this type of early medicine, to thinking about creating pathogen shields and being able to predict the mutations that can come from viruses and try to create something that can protect us from that, on and on. I'm not going to tell you all the details, but I'd love, happy to have a discussion. But this is the basic concept, and we think this is plausible because we believe that the bioplatforms can and do exist to go after this if the right conditions were set, whereby this becomes a priority on the agenda for better healthcare and better public health. Thank you.
Thank you, as usual, erudite and a great concept going forward. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and certainly the audience may have a series of questions. Let me just ask you to begin with. The concept of preemptive is to delay the onset of progression of pre-disease. That means that you have to be able to define what pre-disease is. Can you help me expand that a little bit versus prevention?
Well, I think that, so there are plenty of instances where people have studied prediabetes, for example, and precancerous conditions. I mean, polyps in colon cancer that lead to colon cancer. Is that a disease? Or you could call it a disease, but you could also call it a pre-disease that will result in some probability. So I think that the pathological processes, the cellular processes that lead to an end state as it relates to that preliminary stage that we then call disease, it's not like this happens when a diagnosis is made. This has been happening for months and years, Victor, as of all people you know extremely well because you worked on this. And the question becomes, what can we actually do better than saying this is before disease, this is after disease, but rather stage it so that, like, one of our projects is working very carefully at seeing if we could stage a NAFLD and pre-NAFLD condition where we could identify people that are within 6 months of getting an FLD diagnosis. If we can, and if we can intervene with that, then the question is, can we delay in a placebo-controlled experimental clinical trial the onset of what we would then consider an FLD? And what would that effect be on health economics, and what would that be on a person's disease progression? That's what we mean by pre-disease. And we think it applies to many, if not all, disease conditions.
Yeah, so it's distinctive from predictors, predictive medicine, which would take the larger population and look at who's likely to get disease, to whereby staging the progression, if you will, onset of disease from a pre-state to a state. So in other words, I see this as a funnel. You have the entire population, and then you would have a at-risk population. And that risk population, as they move towards disease, you find sensors of markers to be able to say, you're about to get the disease, you're pre-disease, that's when the intervention is. Is that what you mean?
It is what I mean, and I think it's fair to say that it's a continuum, but the advantage of finding people that are very close is that actually your trials are quite a bit shorter, and you can show the proof of concept, after which you can expand and say, okay, I want to do something 2 years before, if I can identify people that are 2 years or 5 years. And eventually, obviously, you get back to genetic markers and predeterminants. But we're not starting from birth forward, we're starting from disease backwards. And the data is agnostic as to which direction you use it in. So yes, we'd like to be able to identify, if I can call it this way, pre-patients with pre-disease that we could pre-treat to preempt the disease. So that's what we'd like to do. So
to me, it's a spectrum of going from population to precision public health to preemptive health. You know, these are 3 steps, right? And so it may be more cost-effective, if you will, so you don't give, let's say, a drug to everybody to prevent or do whatever measures. You actually give it to ones who are likely to enter a disease state, and be more cost-effective. That clearly leads me to the questions of equity and affordability. In other words, whatever technology you come up with, I see you have a list of things like sensors and BioShield and others that you could even possibly preempt the progressive disease through some treatment or the other will require, in fact, some intervention that's going to be, you have to pay for it, right? So are we going to see an issue of equity?
I mean, I think that I believe that by definition, the kind of, if I can call it loosely, weapons we need before all hell's broken loose systemically of a disease versus what we would need at the earliest of early stages, I think there's reason to believe that you need far less complexity at the level of the solution when the actual process is not integrated the whole physiology of the person. So as a result, I believe that the cost of doing this, on the one hand, at the level of one molecule and one intervention, should be possibly a lot lower. Second, then the question is, how many people are you giving it to? If you had to give it to everybody, like you do a prophylactic vaccine, well, then it's going to be cost prohibitive. So that's the other part where through markers, through digital technologies, we need to be able to narrow it so that you're actually giving it to people who are in that zone. Now, then it's a societal decision as to whether that's a right, like many of these vaccines at birth, et cetera, or subsidized or completely paid for, or whether it's something that you're doing as a privilege. And if it becomes a privilege, it will create inequity. So no question that the inequity part would be a sorry consequence of an attempt to bring this upstream. Done right, I think this will be far more accessible. But it's a societal discussion. You really need to decide that protecting people's health becomes a human right, not just treating it.
Okay, so we have questions from the floor. Jack Rowe, who you probably know, has got a question. Jack?
Yeah, thank you very much. The major risk factor for cancer, heart disease, dementia, osteoporosis, arthritis, et cetera, is age. Advancing age is associated with dramatic increases in these and many diseases. And geroscience is now accelerating rapidly in identifying factors that seem to be regulatory in the senescence process. So makes me wonder whether or not you have in your repertoire or your portfolio targets that are related to senescence that might be applicable to this approach that you're articulating?
So indeed, some of these processes can be evidenced in a cellular context, and we have actually one company called Celerity that's using single molecule RNA sequencing to create this kind of cell state change maps that can detect all sorts of cell state changes, including those that are associated with cellular senescence. And targeting those should have a particular effect with kind of diseases that are the result of aging. I cannot say that we have gotten to the point where we can show proof of concept, but the capabilities of combining machine learning with cell state change tracking and making these maps to finding corresponding molecules that can reverse some of these processes or slow them down, those tools all exist, and we now are interested in using them for some of these applications that you're mentioning as well, which are age-related.
Janet Vega.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask if you could provide some sense on timing, meaning over the next years, what can we expect, what first and what later? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We are approaching this from both sides. We are spending quite a bit of effort discussing this concept, and I'm thankful for this forum to be able to bring it up as well, discussing it from the point of view of policy, regulatory, reimbursement, etc. Because unless the groundwork is laid there and there's real pull for such a capability to exist, I think it's discouraging to the innovators who want to create the push, right? At the same time, we're also developing the push, and we hope that somewhere in the middle you can build that bridge from both sides. That's at least our mental model. Now, specifically, we have some early projects going on. For example, I mentioned in NASH NAFLD of identifying these pre-disease markers that allow us to stage, and that's the key to being able to do clinical studies, even upstream of disease, so not clinical trials, but clinical studies, to see if we can show delays. And of course, we could start with compounds and other bioactives that are GRAS, so that you don't have to introduce a whole new medicinal product, and then eventually expand the pool. So we're working on that. We think over the next 12 months or so, we'll have a number of data from animal models, and that'll be the prelude to human. The other one I'll give you as an example is a project we're working on, which is called Harbinger Health. And here, what we've done is we've taken the idea of circulating DNA-based cancer detection all the way upstream to stage 1 and, in fact, stage 0 cancer, which is there is no other way to see it except we have a signature of a vast number of cancers that we're able to detect that we could see at a very, very early stage. So look at it this way. You know about GRAIL, you know about Thrive. There's companies who are going after being able to detect cancer from circulating markers. We have applied this using biological signatures, not statistically derived, to attempt to go after very early stage cancer, in fact, cancer that cannot be detected. With the same signature as with the passage of time, you will see the cancer manifest in various other techniques. And if we can do that, so not early detection of late cancer, but early detection of early cancer, and for that matter, pre-cancer, we think that can also have a pretty dramatic effect. Now you might say, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is, of course, you're going to do studies and trials with some of the first-line treatments, but much, much earlier than are being used today. That's what we hope will be the result of that. So we want to show a couple of proofs of concept in different types of diseases through different projects, and then encourage the policy side to act kind of more with this pull as opposed to wait till 10 years, 20 years before all this is done, because I'm afraid the innovators won't innovate in this direction unless that signal from society is pretty clear that they value it.
So Nuba, I think Jack Rowe's question to me is really most interesting in the context of aging. Because you think about aging, now first of all, you can say all these chronic diseases are diseases of aging, of the infirmities of aging. True enough. But they're in fact now markers for biologic clock and how rapidly are you aging through epigenetics and others. And of course, Jack talked about senescence of cells. So there's an interesting marker for intervention to make, in fact, your aging process slower, reverse, if not, in fact, prevent the degenerative diseases. And I know that, as you know, Altos and many laboratories are now bringing a lot of really interesting molecular approaches to reverse aging. So that is an interesting convergence, at least for this topic of health longevity. I just thought I'll just mention that. John Wong has a question.
No, thank you very much, and I think congratulations on a spectacular, stable spectrum of technologies. I guess my question relates to, we heard a lot that social determinants of health are probably the biggest risk factor for chronic disease, and if societies have to make an investment, how do they make an investment in trying to address social determinants of health, as well as the tremendous advances in computational biology, as well as molecular biology that you've outlined?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways to think about it, and I'm sure the people in the audience are more expert at this than I will ever be. But one aspect of it, of course, is you need to be able to invest in the underlying, I won't call it basic research, but enabling research that allows you to think of this at a population level without necessarily an end product in mind. And so I think that, and of course you see in in places like the UK, where a lot of the genomic work is being done and connected with health data, that can prove extremely valuable, I think, to being able to get at the, both the, not only the predispositions, but actually what's happening in people's, the way they're living, etc., and tracking it with disease. I think that there is this chicken and the egg. If this is an important issue, we're going to have to shift dollars to this versus paying for the final 2 weeks of people's lives. I don't want to seem uncaring, but the reality is, if there's a zero-sum game, the question is, if we were given the choice between 6 months of delay in onset of disease and X weeks less of life, it's an interesting trade-off. We don't have that choice today because we don't believe we can delay the onset of disease. But then if I asked many of you who are researchers in the room, what's more likely, having an impact on the beginning stages of a disease or the end stages of the disease? I, having spent 35 years developing different forms of drugs and diagnostics and vaccines, I'd take the early stage any day as a tractable problem. So I think it's an incentive issue, and the social determinants become more important if you want to work upstream, I think, than downstream, because all it becomes downstream is an inequity issue and a tracking the growing separation of the haves and the have-nots as it relates to healthcare. Whereas early on, people are more closer in terms of their health state, and if you intervene, you might be able to keep the two curves, if you will, together, if what I'm saying makes sense. So I actually think it'll be interesting. I may not be alive to see that, but if any of this happens, I wouldn't be surprised if in emerging countries, just like cell phones were put in place before landlines were, that preemptive health will be far more affordable than CAR T therapy. Just like, it's an obvious statement, but I think those are going to be tough choices that are going to have to be made. And Europe in between, which is very careful about what they're willing to pay for, I think will be probably a ground zero for the early adoption of this because of their concern about cost. I would hope in the US, especially in self-paying companies and other insurance systems which motivate kind of early detection and treatment of diseases, that there too there could be some early trials. But this is way beyond my pay grade to figure out how it's going to happen.
I have one last comment to make, and then want to just thank you for all this. We've been very interested in National Academy of Medicine on emerging technologies, emerging science and technology, and I have a committee that's gone on for over 2 years, chaired by George Daly, and Atu Boot as well as Otachero, to look at all this emerging technology. What does it really mean in terms of societal implications? Clearly what you do is transformative if it comes to realization. But we also want to look at the unintended consequences of some of these emerging technologies. Are you frozen?
No, I can see you.
Oh, okay,
Sorry.
good. You look frozen for a while. So I would love to have you engage with us in this conversation, because right now we are in the process of doing a consensus study that will come up with all sorts of recommendations for the government to look at new technologies, such as the ones you described, the potential, and how do you actually make very early decisions about equity, very early decisions about unintended consequences, mitigate those. The obvious one, of course, when I'm talking about this AI, genome editing, etc., where it sounds to be all good, and then, of course, it comes out with, for that matter, Facebook, with a lot of issues. So, love to talk to you another time about this, because as you think about these areas, I think it's our obligation to also think about how do you mitigate the issues that are going to come along with it. In your case, obviously, it's one of big issues: equity, regulation, you name it.
Victor, I was going to say, if you give me 10 seconds, what I was looking for as you were talking, I'm going to just flash up one thing and then flash it down, and then I'll say thank you.
Okay.
But basically, this is a slide for a talk that I literally am giving tomorrow, for which I made a slide today. And what this shows you is essentially the type of modalities that existed up until 5 years ago or so, and the modalities that have essentially become are entering clinical trials, and the breadth of them ranging from gene editing to microbiome to mRNA to epigenetic controls. And everything you're saying is right in that we're going to have to deal with these and deal with the unintended consequences, and AI is going to accelerate this even more. So I couldn't agree more that this is both the solution and the future problem.
Right. So I think someone like you, if you can join us, we're actually going to put a follow-up of the study shortly afterwards. And you know many people on this previous committee, including Jennifer Doudna and others, that I think as we go forward, we need your brains to think about how we can work together from a societal point of view of all these emerging technologies you just put on that slide.
It would be my great pleasure, and thanks for including me today, and sorry I couldn't be there in person.
Thank you very much. Let me give you a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.